before we drift into old stone alleys and quiet canals, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Tell me your city or country in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far this gentle journey travels. Imagine the world before Venice had a name, when the northern Adriatic was a soft, shifting border between land and sea. The tide moved like a sleepy breath over a broad lagoon, shallow sheets of water sliding across sandbars and braided channels, retreating to reveal mudflats stippled with reeds. Out at the edge, long barrier islands, what we now call the Lido and Pellestrina, took the first brunt of the waves. Inside their shelter the water grew calmer, brackish and green, the perfect nursery for fish, eels, and the quiet life of salt marshes. In this half-land, half-water place, people learned not to fight the tide but to lean into it, to float with it, to let it decide the rhythm of their days. On the mainland, Roman roads ran straight and sure, but time frayed them. In the 5th and 6th centuries, armies came and went, Huns sweeping through the Veneto, later the Lombards pushing down from the north. Families from cities like Aquileia, Altino and Padua gathered what they could carry and slipped toward the reeds, steering for the low islands that rose like knuckles from the lagoon's flats. They did not come to found a miracle. They came to hide, to wait, to outlast. They found that the water was a gentler wall than stone. Invaders on horseback could not gallop through a maze of shoals. A hostile army might burn a town, but it could not set fire to brine. At first they built in the simplest ways. They drove timber piles into the mud. Thick trunks sunk so deep the oxygen could not reach them, so the wood would not rot. Over those vertical forests they laid rafts of horizontal beams, and on that springy platform raised huts of wicker and timber, daubed with clay. The islands with firmer ground, Torcello, Burano, Mazzorbo, attracted more families. Fires glowed at night across the flats, small orange signals that a new kind of life was taking hold. If a channel shifted, they shifted with it. If a sandbar rose, they tied boats there and claimed it with more piles, more platforms. The lagoon was not a fixed address. It was an understanding. They learned to read it intimately. The wind from the northeast, the Bora, could rake the surface into a brittle chop. A sirocco from the south pressed water inland and deepened the tide. Twice a day the level changed, but not like a clock, because the moon and the weather shared the job. In winter, heavy river water exhaled into the lagoon from the Sile, the Brenta, the Piave. In summer, evaporation thickened the salt. The people trimmed their lives to these breaths. Nets were set where mullet would funnel with the tide. Traps were placed for eels in the cold months when the water cooled and thickened. Reed cutters moved through ankle-deep shallows to gather canes for thatch and wattle. Salt makers raked shimmering beds in late summer, when sun and wind did half the work for them, leaving behind a white crop in a place where grain was scarce. From the start, the water was more than shelter. It was highway. Short, flat-bottomed boats, easy to beach, easy to pole, slid along channels that looked like pale blue veins in the marsh. You could reach Treviso up the Sile, Padua, and the Po Valley by the Brenta, and with a fair wind and some courage, ports along the Adriatic. Barges carried clumps of turf, planks of alder and larch, buckets of lime, sacks of grain. If you had no coin, you traded fish for firewood, salt for flour, rope for tools. People who once lived by city walls relearned the habits of water villages, tying moorings with a half-hitch blindfolded, listening for the hollow slap that meant a shoal was near, tasting a fingertip of water to guess the strength of a tide. The early community did not spring into statehood like a trick of magic. It grew by layers. Counts and bishops from the mainland nurtured claims. The still strong empire of the East, Byzantium, reached across the Adriatic with officials and oaths. Local island judges sorted out quarrels over nets and moorings. For a time, the ducal seat may have been on Malamocco, a settlement perched near one of the main inlets, where seawater and lagoon water exchanged their greetings every day. Later, people gathered on a clutch of higher ground around the Rialto, where markets could expand and boats could turn. But for a long while, power meant the ability to move men and timber quickly through water, to keep channels open, to decide who could fish where and who could levy customs on a load of salt. Torcello stands as an early memory of this half-drowned world. Once it was lively. A bishop's seat, workshops, the glint of money in a market that felt closer to the sea than to land. Imagine the morning light on its cathedral stone, the slow tolling of a bell stitched into the noise of gulls and oars, the smell of eel smoke from low sheds. Over time, as channels silted and the water around Torcello grew stagnant, much of that life shifted toward the deeper heart of the lagoon, yet the habit of moving with the water, that stayed. The people learned an urban version of nomadism, not wandering miles, but edging their focus from one knot of islands to another as the lagoon whispered changes. The building itself was a kind of patient alchemy. Piles went down by the thousands, taken from forests in the Alps and the Dinaric ranges. Rafts of logs floated through the river mouths to staging yards where men with chapped hands and practiced eyes sorted timber by thickness, straightness, and spring. On top of this underwater carpentry, masons laid thick slabs of Istrian stone, a pale, hard limestone that resisted salt and time. Bricklayers raised walls not in showy haste but in careful modular measures, because to build light and strong was to respect the ground. A house that was too eager would sink itself. A house that was wise would settle slowly and last. Daily life had the hum of practical ritual. Before dawn, in boats painted dark to hide the scuffs, fishers moved out to the Baron, the salt meadows, where channels braided like uncombed hair. They watched for ripples that ran against the wind and marked a school beneath. In the markets near Rialto, trestle tables unfolded like origami, hung with gleaming fish whose names came from habit rather than Latin. A few stalls sold garlic braids and onions from plots on Sant'Erasmo, where the soil was good and the tide gentle enough for fencing. Other tables heaped salt by the measure, a currency that could be eaten, stored or traded, all three at once. There were no straight streets, only decisions repeated so many times they formed paths. The short crossing here, the longer loop there, the quiet eddy behind a boathouse if the wind was cruel. To move through this place was to accept a symmetry. Boats were made to favour one side, not by accident but by a steady refinement that made steering easier in narrow water. Oars were not dipped like knives but pressed, feeling for purchase, the rower's body reading the feedback of the blade and the current together. Even conversation bent to the water. People spoke in short phrases, so a gust would only steal a clause, not a meaning. Religion and governance too adapted to the tide. Churches lifted their floors on platforms so that an unusually high tide would slide in and leave again without a quarrel. Market regulation said where to moor and how to measure, a yard of cloth, a basket of fish, a cup of salt, all because ambiguity in a floating city can sour everything. If a quarrel flared, elders weighed not only the words but the season. A man who swore badly in January, hungry and cold, might be forgiven more easily than the same word said in June when boats were fat with catch. To drink the people harvested rain. Wells in the middle of squares were not holes down to groundwater, that would have drawn brackish salt, but wide stone-lined basins filled with layers of sand that filtered the rain caught from rooftops and courtyards. Water, slowing through sand, emerged cool and sweet at the well mouth. After a dry summer, you pulled up a bucket knowing it was not merely water, it was all the roofs of your neighbours, all the careful sweeping and mending that kept the catchment clean, a shared effort turned liquid. The lagoon demanded constant maintenance, which became a culture of its own. Men with poles and long shovels, dredgers before the word was grand, kept the channels open by coaxing mud where it should go. If you neglected a channel, it would sulk and silt. If you trimmed it, it would stay friendly. Markers, bundles of piled timber we now call bricole, showed safe lines even when the light was bad. Children learned to read them the way mainland children learned to follow hedgerows. The soundscape was made of quiet artisanry. The tap of a caulker's mallet sealing a seam with fibres, the rasp of a plane on a mast, the whisper of fresh rope drawn through a worker's hands. In such a world, bravery was mostly patience. There were storms, and there were times when autumn tides ran high and pushed water into doorways. There were winters when a skim of ice formed and made a day of work more brittle. But the people's answer was steady. Raise a threshold, lift a floor, adjust your route, repair, wait. They had no illusion that the sea could be conquered. They made a compact instead. The lagoon would protect them from cavalry and siege. They would keep the lagoon's veins clear and not choke them with greed. Trade grew from this patience like a tree from a well-watered courtyard. A fisherman who knew the channels knew also the quickest way to carry letters to the mainland. A salt-maker who cared for his pans understood the timing of tides in a way that made him a good pilot for a grain barge. Small competencies braided into larger ones. A neighbour might ask another to carry a bundle to Treviso, and then a second bundle to a man in Ravenna, and then a third, more valuable, to a counting house in Grado. Each successful errand built a thread of trust, and soon those threads formed a net sturdy enough to catch opportunity. Stories also travelled these routes, and with them, a sense of belonging that was neither fully Roman nor simply barbarian nor purely Byzantine. It was lagoon-born. People kept saints' days but timed their processions so boats could cross at slack water. They wove patterns into nets and textiles that echoed the ripples they lived among. They carved their door lintels with modest symbols, a fish, a knot, a star, that said more about livelihood than lineage. If they wore wealth, it was often in practical form, a fine blade that cut rope clean, a cloak oiled against spray, a lantern whose glass could be polished clear and bright. Even the sky participated. Mornings over the marsh were often pearl grey, then pale blue, then a white so clean it looked like bleached bone. At dusk, the low sun struck the water and turned the channels into soft metal. Night navigation depended on the low fires of neighbours and the roll of stars overhead, which were steadier than any landmark on a shore that shifted with each decade. A child could stand at the edge of a quay and learn the first constellations reflected in the water as much as in the sky, the way one learns a new language by watching lips and listening to breath at the same time. This is the texture of the era before ships sailed out under grand banners, before diplomats with seals and ribbons arrived, before scholars argued over constitutions and councils. The first Venetians set their lives on timber that they could not see once the water closed over it. They trusted the invisible, piles, currents, pacts and habits, more than the showy and the sudden. They bent their craft to the lagoon's grammar until it became their own, and in the quiet multiplication of small practical decisions, one more pile driven true, one more channel dredged to the right depth, one more net mended by dim firelight, the outline of a city began to appear, not yet proud, not yet famous, but already unlike any place on land. Picture power as a careful choreography rather than a solo dance. In Venice, no single man was supposed to move too boldly or too fast. Every step met a counter-step, every decision a second opinion. At the centre stood the Doge, robed in gold and wearing the stiff-horned corno ducal, but his splendour was deliberately bounded. When he swore his oath of office, the promission, he promised not to rule like a prince, but to abide by a long, ever-lengthening list of limits. No private letters to foreign rulers without witnesses, no marriages arranged for advantage without the state's approval, no gifts accepted that might smell of favour. Each new doge's oath was edited by the patricians to close whatever loopholes the previous one had discovered. It was government by memory. Mistakes became paragraphs. Temptations became prohibitions. Around him, the city's councils formed rings like the growth lines in a tree. The nearest ring was the minor council, 6 ducal councillors who sat with the doge daily and could smother a rash idea at birth. With them and the heads of the High Court known as the Quarantia, they formed the Signoria, the face of the state, what foreign envoys bowed to, what decrees were issued in the name of. Beyond that was the Great Council, the vast assembly of patricians whose membership had been locked in the late 13th century so that nobility became a closed body. To sit there meant your family had a name inscribed in the city's registers and a history of service on the water or in the counting houses. The Great Council did not debate like a modern parliament so much as decide who would decide. It filled offices, confirmed laws, and fed the smaller, more agile bodies with people and legitimacy. The Senate, called the Pregadi, the invited, handled the nervous system of policy, trade agreements, convoy schedules, grain imports, and the endless correspondence that kept far-flung interests from fraying. Senators were often former magistrates and seasoned merchants who knew the price of timber in Dalmatia, the mood of a Paduan podesta, and the winter winds of the Aegean. They counted risk in cargo and wind, and they issued orders to captains with a precision that looked like micromanagement but felt, to Venetians, like prudence. In a city where wealth floated, details were bulwarks. Hovering like a watchful shadow was the Council of Ten, born from crisis, after an early 14th century conspiracy and kept on because it proved terribly useful. The Ten were not meant to run everything, yet in moments of danger, war, espionage, treason, they could act quickly, summon witnesses, examine papers, and seal decisions with unusual speed. They worked with a trio of inquisitors of state in the most sensitive matters, and though their very name could tighten a throat, their existence reassured a people who feared faction more than severity. Venice preferred a brief, precise cut to a long, festering wound. Elections were engineered like clockwork. To choose a doge, the city used an alternating dance of lots and votes meant to break the back of faction. Groups of electors were drawn by chance from the Great Council, then reduced by chance again, then those survivors elected a larger group by vote, which was again reduced by lot, and so on, until the final 41 electors sat together. Only then did the real voting begin, and the winner needed a commanding majority. It was tiring by design. No family could plan every turn, no orator could hypnotize the same crowd twice, and the yoke of the office landed on a man already tested by a maze that punished schemers and rewarded the patient. Not every important office was temporary. The procurators of San Marco, second only to the Doge in prestige, served for life, guardians of the basilica's treasures, the management of charitable foundations, and a great deal of the city's financial housekeeping. Their permanence calmed markets and steadied the public purse. Around them swarmed a republic of magistracies with names as practical as their duties, officials for the arsenal and for the mint, for health and quarantine, for blasphemy and public morals, for bridges, waterways and the upkeep of wells, for the provisioning of grain and the price of bread. Venice broke the business of governing into fine threads and gave each thread to hands skilled at that exact weave. Justice lay in layered courts. The Quarantia handled major criminal and civil matters. Other benches specialized further. The Avogadori di Comune, a trio of tireless public prosecutors, defended the law itself, ready to challenge even the Great Council if a statute was mangled or ignored. This was a city that treated process like a seawall. Every oath, every reading, every second and third reading, every signature in the correct ink in the correct place. It was slower than passion, and stronger than it too. To keep corruption from rooting, Venice relied on rotation and short terms. Many posts ran for 6 months or a year. Even the most capable men were moved along before entrenched loyalties hardened. Collegiality, ruling in small groups, meant no one was alone with power long enough to be tempted into thinking it belonged to him. Decisions needed counter-signatures. Seals needed witnesses. Letters needed to be opened and read aloud in the presence of more than one pair of eyes. A single elegant principle underwrote the whole design. If every path of authority meets another path, traffic slows, collisions are avoided, and no one will drive the city off a causeway into the sea. Beyond the lagoon, on the terraferma, and across the Stato da Mar, Venice set rectors, podesta, captains and provveditori to govern subject cities and islands. Their terms were brief, their salaries fixed, their accounts audited on return with an exactitude that could make a careless man wince. They travelled with small households instead of retinues, for private armies belonged to tyrants, not to a republic jealous of its citizens' equality before the law. Local customs were not casually erased. Venice preferred a tight leash on coin and courts to a heavy hand on daily life. Grain must flow, harbours must be dredged, contracts must be obeyed. That was the Republic's refrain. The Chancery, staffed by highly trained secretaries, many drawn from the class of long-resident citizens who were not noble, kept records like a second memory. Carefully indexed registers of decrees, treaties, lawsuits, ship manifests and diplomatic dispatches meant that yesterday's promise could be checked tomorrow and a clause found again after a decade. Archivists and notaries were quiet powers in a state that worshipped documentation. When the Senate debated a treaty clause, a clerk could produce a near-identical line from an agreement 20 years old, the ink still dark, the logic still crisp. Votes themselves were physical rituals. Councillors cast little balls, ballot, into urns to say yes, no or abstain. The sound of a single ball, a quick tap, tight in a councillor's palm was privacy made audible. Secret ballots protected dissenters. A body of proud merchants could disagree with courage if their faces were not put on the scale for all to see. Tallies were announced. A scribe wrote them. The paper went to its proper place. Power here made a habit of leaving footprints. The city's fear of faction showed up in unexpected corners. Marriages among the patriciate were watched closely, for too many alliances between a few houses might create a block large enough to tilt the boat. Displays of private wealth were fenced by sumptuary laws. A patrician might be rich, but he was not to look like a prince in a city that insisted it had none. The preferred splendour was public, festivals paid for by confraternities, state ceremonials in which the doge was only the first among many, rather than private peacockery that could sour the eyes of equals. To become and remain a patrician was to live inside a web of duties. Attendance in councils was recorded, absences were fined. Refusing an assigned office cost money and face. A noble's sons were groomed for service, learning the rhythms of the councils as naturally as they learned the turn of an oar. Some families specialised, one house famous for admirals, another for diplomats, a third for financial prudence. But the state tried to prevent any single ability from hardening into exclusive property. Rotation diluted monopoly, apprenticeship spread competence. When danger brushed the lagoon, rumours of a plot, a foreign agent plying a loose-tongued clerk, the state opened the letterboxes set in certain walls where citizens could slip accusations, the famous Bosche di Leone carved like open mouths. Not every anonymous note was trusted, but enough proved useful that the boxes remained. From there, trained officials sifted whispers into testimony, testimony into evidence, and evidence into cases with names and dates and seals. In all this, the Council of Ten's reputation for speed and discretion kept people wary. It was better not to test the system's reflexes. Religion, commerce and government braided together in ways that steadied rather than inflamed. The procurators managed charitable legacies that fed widows and dowries for poor girls. The Senate calculated convoy timetables to avoid both storms and pirates. Health magistrates ordered quarantines at the first sign of plague, sending ships and people to the lazaretti in the lagoon's outer reaches until danger passed. None of this felt like the thunder of a king's decree. It felt like the city's habit of care. Sometimes fussy, sometimes obstinate, mostly effective. Even the city's ceremonies taught the lesson of balance. On Ascension Day, the Doge's symbolic marriage to the sea, the golden ring cast into the Adriatic, was not an act of dominion but of renewal, a promise to keep the water friendly by respecting it. In the same way, the government promised to keep itself friendly by tying itself to forms that resisted haste. Multiple readings, layered approvals, careful minutes. The ring and the record book were cousins. Beneath the patriciate, Venice's engine ran on the skill of non-noble citizens who held technical and administrative posts for years, carrying institutional knowledge from one short-term magistrate to the next. A republic of merchants needed calculators, copyists, pilots, surveyors, shipwrights, and doctors who stayed when politics turned over. The state rewarded them with status, stable careers, and protections even if it never opened the Great Council's doors. In return, they ensured that promises made on the Rialto were fulfilled at the arsenal and recorded in the chancery. The design had a cost. Decisions could be slow, and originality sometimes drowned in caution. But for a city that feared the sea's sudden moods, slowness felt like safety. Where other states were undone by heirs, coups, and favourite courtiers, Venice trusted its committees, its ballots, its clerks, and its habit of writing everything down. The Doge's throne was heavy and magnificent, yet it sat on a floor supported by many piles, councils, courts, offices, oaths, driven deep into the mud of custom. If one pile failed, the others held, so the Republic endured, not because it produced the boldest geniuses, but because it made a craft of governance the way it made a craft of shipbuilding, with standardized parts, trained teams, and constant inspection. A new official stepped into old procedures the way a sailor steps onto a familiar deck. He knew where the ropes lay, which ones were load-bearing, which knots would hold in a squall. In Venice, this was the quiet art of staying upright. A city that built its politics like its palaces, on foundations you could not see but could trust, tested twice a day by tides, and still there in the morning. Think of a city that put its heartbeat inside a set of walls. Behind tall brick ramparts and a monumental gate, the workday began with the groan of winches and the ring of hammers, 1,000 small sounds weaving into one steady breath. The Venetians called it the arsenal, and the word itself, rooted in the Arabic for house of industry, says what it was. Not a yard or a single shed, but a complete disciplined world where timber became fleets, rope became sea roads, and careful routine became power. The place was huge, spreading along a protected basin under the watching eyes of guards and magistrates. You would enter past a marble portal guarded by stone lions added in a later century, step through to long quays and water lanes where narrow basins cut deep into the complex like fingers. Everything touched water. Workshops opened directly onto canals so hulls, spars and barrels could slide from bench to boat without wasted motion. The older core, the first cluster of docks and sheds, had multiplied over time, sprouting an old arsenal and a new one, covered slips where rain could not delay a keel, and warehouses with smooth floors burnished by sleds and bare feet. Inside, order reigned in a way the lagoon never could. Outside, channels shifted. Inside, measurements did not. Start with the trees. Venice's ships began life on mountainsides far away, in the Balkans, the Alps, Istria, where timber contractors marked straight pines and tough oaks, felled them in the right season, and floated them downriver in rafts. The Republic had officials whose whole job was wood, choosing, counting, paying, preventing theft and timing deliveries, so the seasoning yards at the arsenal were never empty and never clogged. The logs arrived with river mud still clinging to their bark, were stacked with the grain aligned to breathe, and left to dry under watchful eyes, because a rushed piece of timber will warp your fortunes as readily as it warps a deck plank. When they were ready, sawyers split and cut them following hanging templates, curved wooden patterns that dictated the precise shape of a rib or knee. This ordinary magic, one shape copied 100 times, was the secret of speed. Every piece had a place before a ship had a name. Walk the rope works and you meet the second river of the arsenal. A building as long as a city block, high-ceilinged and almost windless, held the cordery, the rope walk, where teams of men twisted hemp into lines with patient, even steps. Fibres combed and cleaned, weighed and measured, were walked down the hall, tensioned with whirling spindles until they became cordage of every thickness. Fine running rigging that whispered through blocks, great anchor cables that creaked like old trees. Nearby, tar simmered in cauldrons, black and sticky, to dress the ropes against salt and rot. The smell clung to everything: pitch, resin, pine. And if you worked here long enough, you carried the arsenal's perfume on your clothes home to supper. There were rooms for sails where women and men in teams spread white cloth in fields of needles. They cut panels to patterns, stitched seams in long straight rows, and reinforced corners with leather and doubled cloth because the wind is polite to no one. Bolts of hemp and linen were logged in ledgers that tracked who took what and when, a line of ink as strict as any officer. Anchors and nails came from forges that glowed dull orange in the half-light, and the anchor smiths knew the taste of iron on the air the way fishermen knew the taste of a coming storm. Every trade had its room, every room its foreman, every foreman his books. The hulls rose in covered galleries, the famous ship halls where rain on tile made a soft hiss while joiners worked. First the keel, straight, strong, trued so carefully that it could be trusted for years. Then the ribs, bent to form with steam and cunning, set into the keel like the bones of a long lean animal. Planking came next, fitted plank by plank, the seams caulked with oakum, hemp fibre hammered in with mallets, and paid with hot pitch that smoked and gleamed. A foreman, stick of chalk in hand, kept a schedule pinned to a board and a clock in his head. He knew how many days until launch, how many oars still to shape, how many barrels of biscuit to load before the convoy deadline. It was craft elevated to schedule, not a single masterpiece but a repeatable miracle. They built two families of ships that mattered most. War galleys, sleek, shallow, knife-like, were made for sudden speed and hard blows, with a beak on the bow and artillery braced amidships. Merchant galleys, the heavier, broader cousins, carried spices and silk behind high sides and stout decks. Later, when artillery changed sea fights, Venice experimented with hybrids that stood taller in the water and carried more guns, answering each new threat with a new proportion of beam to length, oar to sail. But whatever the design, the arsenal's method stayed recognisable. Standard parts, practised hands, and an assembly that moved like a tide from timberyard to slip. It was said, often and by people who wanted to sound impressed, that the arsenal could build a ship in a day. The version most retold involves a French king shown a hull taking shape before breakfast and sliding into the water by dusk. Whether the demonstration happened exactly as told matters less than what made the story plausible. The parts were ready. Keels were laid out, frames were stacked like a vocabulary waiting for a sentence. Masts, spars, oars, anchors, blocks and rigging were all in numbered racks, labelled in a hand any clerk could read. Assembly line is a modern phrase, but the principle, many small steps arranged so the work flows, lived here centuries before the word existed. The people who made it move were called simply the arsenalotti. They were not nobles with fine names. They were joiners, caulkers, rope makers, sawyers, smiths, sailmakers, coopers, carters, and boatmen. Many belonged to guilds, but inside these walls they answered first to the state, to the provveditori who managed the complex, to the captains who oversaw naval readiness, and to the Senate that set budgets and schedules. Wages were logged carefully, and so were fines for tardiness or sloppy work, because a poor seam that opens at sea is not a private mistake. The arsenalotti had privileges too: steady pay even in lean seasons, access to the state's medical care and injuries, and a certain pride that came from knowing the city breathed by their hands. In crises, the government asked these men to take up arms, and they did, because this was their fortress as well as their workplace. Provisioning happened with the same matter-of-fact precision. Ships leaving in convoy took on barrels of hard biscuit from state bakehouses, salted meat, dried legumes, oil, vinegar, and fresh water measured for a crew that could number into the hundreds. Powder, shot, pikes, crossbows, later muskets, all tallied in armourers' rooms lined with racks. When a captain received his papers, he did not simply get a letter of instruction. He signed for inventories that could later be checked against returns. If a storm broke a mast and it had to be cut loose, a note in the margin would explain it. If shot ran low, there would be a record of the exchange with a friendly port. Discipline lived in ink as much as in orders. Look up at the covered slips designed in the High Renaissance, and you see beauty harnessed for utility. Graceful arches sheltering work from sun and rain, symmetrical bays that meant 2 or 3 hulls could be built side by side without crowding. On launch days, the arsenal was theatre. Wedges knocked loose, greased ways took the weight, and a hull slid down with a slow, heavy joy into its element. Blessings were said, names pronounced, oars and sails fitted, and then, this was the real mark of the place, the work went on in the next bay without fuss, because the habit of readiness mattered more than any single celebration. Security was both visible and invisible. Guards watched the gates, keys were counted, fires were controlled, and the storage of powder followed rules that kept sparks far away. The walls kept strangers out, but the procedures kept accidents from becoming disasters. Even rumours were managed. If someone whispered about theft or bribery, Venice had channels for that, and officials who investigated with a speed that discouraged carelessness. The arsenal's best defence, though, was pride. Men talked about it the way sailors talk about their ships, with a possessive pronoun. It was not the arsenal, it was ours. The connection between factory and sea was never an abstraction. Convoys, called Mude, sailed on schedules that tied the arsenal's calendar to the winds of the eastern Mediterranean and the North Atlantic. Spring departures for Flanders and England, autumn returns, summer runs to Alexandria and the Levant, taking on pepper and sugar and dye, coming back with profits that paid wages and bought more timber. Each convoy had state captains whose authority reached from the quayside to the foreign docks, and each captain carried the unspoken weight of the men behind him who had made his ship possible. When pirates grew bold or a rival fleet menaced trade routes, the response began here with a new list of parts, a reshuffled priority, a fresh keel laying on a Monday morning. Standardization reached down to details a traveller would miss. Oars were cut to lengths measured by the distance between thole pins on a particular class of galley. Blocks were sized by the circumference of the line they would serve. Nails, trunnels of wood and spikes of iron came in labelled bins, counted out by boys who learned numbers by the feel of a handful of metal. Patterns hung on pegs like an alphabet. This curve for the third frame from the bow, that notch for the mast partner, this gentle S for the knee that would sit under the main beam. If a foreman shouted for a part, a runner could fetch it blindfolded just by touch and count. The administration that kept this heart beating was as carefully jointed as the ship's. A hierarchy of officers scheduled work, balanced urgent military needs against regular commercial ones, and audited accounts with a thoroughness that could make a sloppy man wish he'd never learned to write. Inspectors walked the sheds with tablets and styluses. Clerks posted new lists on doors. Messengers slid across the basin in low boats carrying orders sealed with wax, the state's crest reflecting in the canal. When the Senate decreed that a certain number of hulls should be ready by a certain date, that demand travelled through ranks of people who knew exactly which rack to check and which bench to hurry. Fire, always the enemy of wood and tar, was watched the way sailors watch a lee shore. Braziers had places and hours. Scrap was cleaned away. Water stood ready in tubs under eaves. The fact that the arsenal burned rarely, and never in a way that crippled it, was not luck. It was the result of ordinary repeated caution. Rules that workers groaned about and followed, because they wanted to go home with their hands whole and their wages earned. Even the sounds of the place taught its lessons. The steady clack of a shuttle in the sail loft set a tempo that matched the measured swing of a hammer in the caulker's bay. The low whir of twisted hemp in the rope walk harmonised with the rhythmic squeal of a capstan under load. Voices in many dialects, Dalmatian timbermen, Lombard smiths, Venetian masters, knitted into a shared language of measures and parts. A visitor might find it noisy, and Arsenalotto heard order. If you step back and look at it whole, the marvel is less any single innovation than the way all the parts fit. The mountain forests, river rafts, seasoning yards, templates, rope walks, sail lofts, forges, covered slips, basins, ledgers, and launchways, none of them glamorous alone, combined into a machine that turned time into readiness. Other states had brilliant admirals and heroic captains. Venice built a place where ordinary skill could become a system, and where the system could outlast the flair of any single genius. A storm might scatter a convoy, a war might demand twice the ships, a plague might thin the workforce. Still the walls stood, the ropes twisted, the planks were laid, and the bell, the Arsenalotti answered, kept time for a republic that understood the sea rewards those who do the same things well and on time for a very long while. Imagine the Rialto at first light, when the stone still holds the nights cool and the Grand Canal looks like beaten tin. Porters roll barrels off low boats, clerks open shutters, a money changer rubs down his bench and checks the weights in his small brass box. Venice wakes as a market does, by inventory, by habit, by the quiet tally of what has arrived and what must go. In this city, borders are mostly water, and therefore negotiable. The lines that matter are measured by scales, contracts, and the reach of a good reputation. Begin with the routes that fed the stalls. From the Levant and Egypt came pepper and ginger, cinnamon and clove, fine cotton, raw silk, sugar loaves, alum for fixing dyes, and carpets rolled tight against damp. From the Black Sea, furs, wax, grain in fat years, and slaves in the hard ones earlier on. Later, more grain when the terra firma harvest failed. From Apulia and Sicily, wheat ships under watchful rules, because bread was the difference between calm and trouble. From Dalmatia and Istria, timber that would become masts or piles, and stone cut to take the sea's bite without crumbling. From the German lands and Flanders, broadcloth and metalware. From Lombardy and Tuscany, finished textiles and paper. From Murano across the water, glass that caught light as if it had a private understanding with the sun. The lagoon's channels were the last, quiet leg of a web that reached farther than any border post could see. Venice sorted this traffic through a simple, powerful idea. The city was a hub, and foreigners were welcomed, organised, counted, taxed, and housed, so that their presence strengthened the hub instead of fraying it. The foreign merchants' houses, the fondaci, were the instruments. Think of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi at the Rialto, a courtyard wrapped in galleries, ground floors turned into warehouses, upper stories into lodgings and offices. A single gate-controlled entry. The customs men kept close. Official brokers, the censali, helped strangers navigate local rules. You paid duties when due, you weighed on certified scales, you used the state's measures and the city's scribes if you wanted your contract to stand in court. The Fondaco dei Turchi by the canal served traders from the Ottoman world. Others catered to Greeks or other communities. The arrangement struck a practical balance, welcome, but with boundaries clear enough to prevent misunderstandings from growing sharp edges. The heart of the market beat at Rialto, where the city set its standard. Bronze L-rods for measuring cloth hung where everyone could see them. Official weights sat in a magistrate's office to check the honesty of scales. If a measure drifted, if a merchant trimmed a pound too daringly, there were fines and public shame. The point was not to bully, it was to make trust routine. A ship unloaded at dawn, a clerk took notes, a broker drafted a sale, A porter shouldered a bale, and a baker knew his flour would be the same flour he had paid for last week. When there is no border to step across, consistency becomes the frontier you defend. Money moved with a finesse that belonged to a maritime people. The gold ducat, the zecchino, introduced in 1284, carried about 3.5 grams of nearly pure gold, so consistently struck that it was accepted from London counting houses to Alexandria stalls without much argument. The silver grosso, older, jingled in purses for everyday use, but coin was heavy and risk clings to metal on long roads, so paper helped. Venetian houses used bills of exchange to move value without hauling chests. Buy a bill here, present it there, let a trusted firm settle the arithmetic. Time and place did the work that interest could not legally do, and the difference in exchange rates paid the bankers trouble. On the benches, the Bansi, money changers reckoned in multiple mints and standards, converting florins to ducats to grossi with a quick palm of the abacus. If a banker failed, the story said his bench might be smashed. Bancarotta. And the word bankrupt kept the echo. Risk at sea was managed with equal clarity. A captain outfitting a voyage might take a bottomry loan, money advanced against the hull and cargo to be repaid only if the ship returned. Or later, insure specific goods with a written policy that listed dangers in a tight, almost superstitious prose. Storm and pirates and rocks and capture, each with its price. The Italian cities pioneered these contracts, and Venice adopted them with a practical zeal, because risk you can write down is risk you can price, and risk you can price is risk you can share. The convoy system, the Mude, wrapped this private calculus in a public one. Set sailing windows, armed escorts, agreed routes, and rules about keeping formation. A merchant might prefer to leave on Tuesday. The Senate might say in a month, with the convoy, and the merchant would grumble and obey, because a safe profit outruns a fast one across a lifetime. Trade needed law the way a ship needs a keel. At Rialto, courts heard disputes in cramped rooms smelling of ink and damp wool. Contracts, policies, exchanges, commenda agreements were drawn by notaries whose hands made letters that looked like braided rope, tight and regular. The commenda, or colleganza in Venetian usage, was an early favourite. One partner stayed at home and advanced capital, another travelled with the goods and labour. Profits were divided by a ratio that reflected risk, and losses too. Limited liability in practice, if not in name. Mobility of talent without the need to be rich. A ladder for a clever youth to climb. A man could go to sea 3 times and come back ready to sit at a desk, his fingers still tar-marked, his mind suddenly crowded with places and prices. Because bread is not a luxury, the city guarded the grain trade with special care. Magistrates for grain, the Ufficiali alle Biade, fixed rules on imports, stockpiled reserves, and watched bakers' loaves for weight and quality. If the Po Valley failed, ships went south. If both failed, the Black Sea became urgent. The Annona, the provisioning system, moved wagons and barges like chessmen, from storehouses to bakers to markets, with careful notes so that fraud had little room to breathe. Price caps during famine years were not charity, they were fire breaks laid carefully ahead of time. Some monopolies belonged to the state because common welfare and steady revenue liked each other's company. Salt, the white mineral that preserved meat and fish and made bland things bright, was a public business. Production in Chioggia and on other pans was regulated, and the Provveditori al Sale managed quantities and prices, so the city's people and its ships both had what they needed, without feeding a private fortune into something too vital to trust. The mint answered to magistrates as well, and the arsenal, where ships became schedules, made sure that trade protection was treated as a public good rather than a private whim. Walk the produce markets by the water, the herbaria, and you see how land and sea braided. Barges from the islands and the mainland arrived with artichokes from Sant'Erasmo, onions and greens, baskets of fruit in season. The pesceria nearby was a choreography of scales and knives. Fish laid out on clean stone glistened in rows learned over generations. Small lagoon catches, Adriatic staples, the rare prize when weather allowed. Prices rose and fell with the tide and the wind, but gouging met a sharp word from officials and from neighbours, which could sting worse. Reputation, in a compact city, is a form of currency that pays or penalises daily. Foreigners carried their own reputations like passports stamped in rumour. German traders at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi came with letters from Augsburg and Nuremberg firms, hungry for pepper and silk, ready to sell cloth and metal goods. Ottoman and Syrian merchants knew the Fondaco dei Turci's rules, paid the customs, kept the peace, and found in Venice a place where disputes could be settled without swords. Greek, Armenian and Dalmatian communities had their churches and confraternities, their shared tables and familiar lanes, comfort enough to make a long absence from home feel less sharp. Diversity was not a slogan. It was the practical architecture of a port that needed many hands and many tongues to keep business flowing. Printing changed the market's cargo as much as spices ever did. When Aldus Manutius made small, beautiful books, he also made a new commodity, portable learning. Bales that once held only cloth now nested crates of editions, the classics trimmed to travel size, italic type flowing like a quick hand across the page. Books moved on the same routes as pepper, subject to the same hazards, insured and argued over with the same seriousness, because a market city learns quickly that anything desired behaves like a spice when properly packaged. Behind the bustle lay numbers. Venetian merchants kept books alla Veneziana, in a double-entry style that balanced debit and credit like a pair of oars. A memorandum of the day's business fed a journal. The journal's neat lines flowed to the ledger. Partners could open to a page and see their risk and reward without drama. Exchange rates scrawled in margins told private stories of distant fairs. Champagne, Bruges, Lyon, later Antwerp. Account keeping did not make a man rich by itself, but it kept riches from slipping away between one tide and the next. The city taxed without breaking the back that carried it. Import duties and market fees funded bridges, embankments, the arsenal's wages, and the endless maintenance of a place that floats. The collectors were watched. Audits were normal. A career could founder on a column of mismatched sums. Large fortunes lent to the state, and the public debt, Montevecchio, Montenuovo, and their descendants, turned private savings into the Republic's long-term spine. Investors received annuities, the state received stability, markets received the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble today in the ways that matter for contracts. Etiquette in trade was as ritualized as church because calm improves arithmetic. A broker introduced two parties. Coffee did not yet steam on tables, but wine and water did. Terms were read aloud, copied twice, sealed. Delivery dates often matched the convoy calendar. Force majeure clauses made weather a name character instead of an excuse. When things went wrong, and they did because the sea is impartial, a path existed for sorting blame from bad luck. The notary's hand, the judge's habit, the city's memory stored in its archives. This was how strangers could behave like neighbours without having to become them. Look closely at a single chain of transactions and you can see the city's entire logic. A boatman from Chioggia lands salt at a regulated price. A wholesaler buys and stores it under the salt magistrate's eye. A tanner purchases a quantity to cure hides in a low building that smells of work. A fishmonger takes another measure to keep a catch from spoiling when the Sirocco slows boats. Duties are paid. A clerk writes the line. At the end of the month, a portion of those coins becomes wages at the arsenal and repairs to a key that all have used. The same coins, in their next life, buy pepper by the ounce from a German trader paying for silk he will send up the Brenner Pass. The circle tightens, then widens, and at each point the city has slipped in a rule to smooth the friction. Even the buildings themselves are part of the market's grammar. Along the Grand Canal near Rialto, The Fabriche Vecchie and Fabriche Nuove held long lines of shops under deep arcades, shade for customers and steady rent for the state. The stone bridge that replaced the old wooden Rialto span in the late 16th century came with shops along its sides, turning a crossing into a marketplace in its own right. Over the water, money moved. Under the arches, bargains settled. On the bridge, strangers became customers and customers became acquaintances. Architecture here is never only pretty. It is a policy you can walk on. Trade across faiths and flags required diplomats as much as captains. Venetian envoys, Bailey in Constantinople, consuls in key ports, argued for commercial privileges, soothed tempers after a quarrel in a harbour, and sent home letters thick with prices and warnings. The Senate read these dispatches with a merchant's eye, adjusting convoy schedules, revising treaties, and setting gentle embargoes when politics to the east or west heated up. For the private trader, this meant that faraway storms were often buffered by the state's long experience with other people's weather. If all this feels intricate, it is the intricacy of a loom. Each thread, fondici, measures, coins, brokers, convoys, courts, salt, grain, debt, bridges, passes over and under others until a pattern appears, a market that is not a free-for-all and not a siege either, but a disciplined openness. A German can buy pepper, a Venetian can buy cloth, a Greek can ship oil, an Armenian can trade silk, and each can sleep mostly well because disputes have addresses and rules have teeth. The lagoon keeps cavalry out, the law keeps chaos out, the habit of fairness keeps the good ships coming back with their holds full and their captains willing to try again. Imagine a city that prayed under gold mosaics copied from Constantinople and bartered under sails stitched to catch the winds of Alexandria. Venice learned early that the sea is larger than any quarrel, and that prosperity lives in the space between rivalry and respect. It kept one hand on the cross and the other on a ledger, and the pages of that ledger ran east. In the beginning, the empire that mattered most was Byzantium. Venice's earliest privileges arrived as imperial chrysobuls, sealed grants from Constantinople that named the lagoon people faithful allies and valuable ferrymen. In exchange for ships and service against pirates and enemies, the Venetians won tax breaks in Byzantine ports, rights to their own quarter in the imperial capital, and the protection of law when disputes inevitably arose. They were guests in the greatest Christian city of the age, but not supplicants. Their quarter along the Golden Horn had wharves, warehouses, a church, and most valuable of all, a habit of being useful. When the emperors needed a fleet quickly, Venice could provide one. When Venice needed pepper unloaded on a day's notice, the imperial dockyards made room. It was a friendship conducted in invoices and oaths. That closeness had a shadow. Commerce sharpened appetites, and the Fourth Crusade showed what happens when zeal meets opportunity. In 1204, Crusaders diverted to Constantinople, and Venetian ships carried them to a conquest that broke the old empire and scattered its treasures west. Venice took a long bill in payment. Islands, ports, and privileges from the Adriatic down through the Aegean, Euboea, Negroponte, Crete, Candia, outposts in the Cyclades, and footholds in the Peloponnese. The Basilica of San Marco in Venice filled with Byzantine light not only by imitation but by inheritance. Icons, columns, bronzes, and the memory of a city cracked open. It was a triumph that tasted of ash. The empire revived in diminished form, and resentment lingered like smoke. Yet even after the rupture, trade did not truly stop. Venice was too deeply woven into Eastern markets to step away. It learned instead the older mercantile lesson. You repair a bridge faster than you build a new road. To the south, in Mamluk Egypt and the ports of Syria, relationships were built on careful pragmatism. Alexandria, Cairo, through the Nile, Damascus and Aleppo became familiar names on Venetian ledgers. Spices from the Indian Ocean, pepper most of all, but also ginger, cinnamon and clove, flowed through the Red Sea to the Nile and across to Alexandria's warehouses, then into Venetian galleys bound for the Adriatic. Alum for dyeing, sugar in white loaves, and fine cottons joined the cargo. Treaties spelled out customs rates, warehousing rules, and court procedures, and they were renewed, with tweaks, as rulers changed and politics shifted. When the papacy embargoed trade with Muslims, Venice negotiated exceptions or quietly stepped sideways around prohibitions. When tempers rose, it sent envoys with gifts and a talent for finding the line between boldness and offence. Translators, the dragomans, turned languages into agreements, and the city learned that diplomacy is another form of navigation. You keep to the channel, but you watch the wind. The Venetians did business with pilgrims as well as princes. Ferries of faith sailed from the lagoon to Jaffa, carrying men and women bound for the Holy Sepulchre under the care of friars. Passengers bought passage with the same matter-of-fact contracts that governed cargo. Captains secured safe conducts. Ships carried water casks and hard biscuit and hope. In these voyages, the city practiced an everyday coexistence that belied rhetoric. Muslim port officials stamped papers for Christian pilgrims who bought dates and oil before returning to a republic that would quarantine them on arrival, not because of creed, but because the plague had no confession. The Lazaretti Islands at the edge of the lagoon, quarantine stations, were secular institutions born from sacred traffic. As empires turned and new powers rose, the eastern horizon changed shape. The Ottomans pressed westward, bringing a military energy that redefined the sea's edges. Venice watched, traded, bargained, and fought when it must. It lost Negroponte to Mehmed II in 1470 and made peace in 1479 on terms that included tribute and commercial rights, a hard line to swallow that still kept the markets open. It lost Modon and Coron, the two eyes of the Republic, to the Ottomans in 1500 to 1501, and with them easy staging points along the Peloponnesian coast. Yet even in defeat, the Venetian instinct for accommodation asserted itself. Ambassadors took up residence in Constantinople, not only to present petitions but to listen. The resident bailo reported prices and moods, a diary of empire written for a senate that valued intelligence more than consolation. Meanwhile, the Republic tended its own necklace of sea stations, the Stato da Mar. Dalmatian ports secured timber and sailors. Island fortresses in the Ionian and Aegean guarded lanes. Crete, held since the aftermath of 1204, became a world unto itself with feudal estates, Latin bishops, Orthodox congregations, and a formidable fortress at Candia, whose bastions drew the best engineers of the day. Cyprus, acquired by inheritance in 1489 when Queen Caterina Cornaro ceded her crown, served as a sugar island and an eastern sentinel until the Ottoman storm broke over it in 1570 to 1571. These territories weren't decorative prizes. They were the practical teeth of a maritime network. Granaries, timber yards, watering points, customs posts, and refugees when weather or war went bad. War with the Ottomans came in cycles, each teaching the Republic how to bleed without emptying its arteries. The long conflict of 1463 to 1479 established a pattern, a contest of sieges and sea fights, followed by a treaty that traded forts for access. In 1499 to 1503, Venice lost more strongholds, but kept its commercial lungs. In 1537 to 1540, alliance with Spain and the papacy faltered into frustration. In 1571, the Holy League won the Great Fleet action at Lepanto, a thunderous victory whose strategic effects were dulled by the speed with which the Ottomans rebuilt. Venice signed peace and counted the cost. Cyprus gone, Famagusta's defenders remembered for a last stand that ended in cruelty, and yet convoys resumed under stamped papers that bore new seals but familiar clauses about weights, rates, and appeals. The 17th century tested patience more than nerve. The Cretan War, 1645 to 1669, dragged on for a generation, with the siege of Candia lasting nearly a quarter of a century. Sappers and countermines, artillery and disease, engineering ingenuity measured against exhaustion. Venice brought allied fleets, hired Dutch and French captains, and fought set-piece battles in the Dardanelles. The Ottomans adapted, returned, endured. When Candia finally fell, the Republic retained only a few Cretan outposts, and the bitter wisdom that some fortresses cannot be kept forever, no matter how fine their angles or how brave the garrison. Yet even after that surrender, Venetian merchants still walk the docks of Smyrna and Constantinople, proof that commercial arteries can reroute around scarred tissue. There were moments of reversal. In the Marian War, 1684 to 1699, Venetian arms under Francesco Morosini swept through much of the Peloponnese, taking towns and fortresses and, to later sorrow, shelling Athens in a way that blew up the Parthenon's powder store. The triumph proved temporary. In 1715 the Ottomans surged back, and the Peloponnese slipped from Venice's grasp. The treaty that followed acknowledged the map's new lines. The Republic, old but still precise in habit, leaned again into what it knew best: negotiated privileges, resident envoys, and the small daily successes of ships that depart and return on time. Across all these arcs of conflict and accommodation, a quieter exchange flowed. Venetian painters learned to render silks and carpets with a sensuality born of familiarity. Murano glassmakers experimented with forms that echoed imported metalwork and rock crystal. The Basilica of San Marco wore an Eastern grammar of domes and gold that never left its bones. Arabic and Turkish words slipped into the speech of dock workers and factors. Coffee arrived and in time changed mornings, then society. In the other direction, Venetian coins and measures, contracts and correspondence styles, and even certain habits of dress travelled east with the goods that paid for them. Traders are reluctant missionaries of custom. They convert not with sermons, but with the convenience of a good notebook and a reliable scale. Religion, the banners and blessings, was never absent, but in practice it rode behind convoy schedules and quarantine rules. The city sent chaplains with fleets and endowments to churches abroad. It also sent inspectors to count sacks of grain, officers to enforce the price of bread, and doctors to the lazaretto when a ship's boy coughed at anchor. When the papacy called for zeal, Venice answered with its own liturgy of prudence. It would fight in Italy today, and if peace brought better margins tomorrow, sign a treaty that allowed its factors to reopen accounts without too much apology. This was not cynicism. It was a kind of civic theology that held the well-being of the community, its livelihoods, its order, its ability to keep promises, as a public good blessed by stability. The techniques that made this balancing act possible were as practical as a carpenter's kit. Treaties were written in layered clauses that separated sacred principle from daily practice. Prohibitions on selling strategic materials might sit beside permissions to trade in foodstuffs. A list of contraband would narrow or widen with the temperature of politics. The resident bailo in Constantinople cultivated a web of clerks and port officials, paid fees that everyone agreed not to call bribes, and watched court factions with the same attention a pilot gives to wind shifts in a channel. Reports home were exhaustive. Price tables, crop forecasts, gossip about an admiral's fall from grace, the reliability of a new customs superintendent. The Senate read, annotated and adjusted policy by degrees, seldom making a bet so large it could not be hedged. Even the state's internal rhythms served this external dance. The convoy system, mewed, tied private ambitions to public safety. Licensing of ships and captains created a register of responsibility. The law courts at Rialto gave foreign merchants confidence that contracts would be enforced without favour. The arsenal translated diplomatic breathing room into hulls and repairs. The Treasury, funded by duties and a managed public debt, paid the annuities that kept citizens invested in the city's long term. In every case, Venice acted as if tomorrow would resemble yesterday enough for rules to matter, but also as if a squall could arrive at any hour, so flexibility must remain within reach. The result was a republic that could fight hard without forgetting to count, and that could count without forgetting when to fight. It sent galleys into the blue water with cannons run out and saintly banners aloft, and it sent letters across desks in languages that made space for both scripture and tariff. Between cross and crescent, it stitched a living made of measured courage, unglamorous patience, and the daily choice to turn enemies back into customers as soon as the noise of victory or defeat faded from the shore. On an island where furnaces pulsed like red hearts, sand and ash were taught to imitate water and light. The masters of Murano learned early that glass is a temperamental pupil. It rewards timing and punishes pride. In the late 13th century, the Republic moved the city's glass furnaces out to Murano, partly to keep deadly fires away from crowded neighbourhoods, partly to gather skill in one guarded place. From then on, the island became a workshop with its own weather. Before dawn, men fed alder and pine to long glowing mouths. By mid-morning, pipes and shears flashed in practised hands. By afternoon, fresh work cooled in annealing ovens so it would not shatter at the first insult of air. The ambition was always the same: clarity like meltwater, forms as thin as courage would allow, colours that held the sun without swallowing it. They called their most coveted product cristallo, a glass so pure it mimicked rock crystal. Achieving it meant ruthlessly refining the raw materials and managing heat, with almost musical control. Once you have crystal, you can begin to dream. Mirrors, for instance. Not the wavy mysteries of cheap glass, but flat, bright planes backed with a tin mercury amalgam that returned a face with terrifying honesty. For a time, Venice owned that reflection. Europe's richest rooms learned to double themselves with Murano sheets, until a rival state finally enticed defectors to spill the process elsewhere. Before and after that moment, the island kept inventing. Opaline latimo that looked like poured milk, aventurine studded with coppery sparkles, glass canes fused into millefiori that seemed to have flowers suspended inside. Beads threaded to Africa and the Levant, chandeliers heavy as arguments hung from palaces on the Grand Canal. Secrecy and status grew together. The guild constrained who could melt, who could cut, who could sell. The state granted privileges and enforced prohibitions against masters, emigrating with the recipes in their heads. At the same time, glassmakers enjoyed social weight rare for artisans. They carried themselves like men whose work, if lost, would dim the city's light. A visitor to a furnace saw more than technique. He saw a choreography. One man gathering a blob at the pipe's end, another blowing, cheeks trembling, a third rolling the orange mass on a marva to tame it, a fourth snipping a lip or trailing a thread of colour that would become a handle or a flourish. No step was solitary. Glass rewards teams. Books were Venice's other furnace, cool to the eye, hot in their effect. In the late 15th century, Aldus Manutius opened a press that changed the pace and scale of learning. He printed in Greek and Latin with types cut for legibility, compactness and beauty. The italic he popularized, drawn by the punch cutter Francesco Grifo. Let more words live on a smaller page without losing grace. His editions shrank scholars' libraries from trunks to satchels. Octavo volumes a person could carry on a journey, dog-ear, and annotate without sacrilege. He chose a printer's device that said everything about his method. An anchor intertwined with a dolphin, the emblem of Festina Lente, make haste slowly. And he lived by it, favouring accuracy over flash, portability over grandeur. The Aldine Press was not alone. The city's damp air did wicked things to paper, but its dry laws protected investment. Printers sought privilegio from the Senate, time-limited rights to publish a particular work or an invention in type, proto-copyright and proto-patent at once. Piracy still happened. Human nature is older than law. but the framework invited capital and talent. Correctors and editors, many trained at the University of Padua on the mainland, collated manuscripts. Proofreaders waged small wars against errors. Compositors set pages so quickly that a visitor could watch a text become a stack of sheets between breakfast and supper. The result was volume. By 1500, Venetian imprints travelled like a tide across Europe's learned tables. Maps and instruments fed the press and were fed by it. In a Murano monastery, the Camaldolese monk Fra Mauro drew a vast circular map around the mid-15th century, crammed with notes that read like footpaths for the eye. Portolan charts, coastal maps built from sailors' bearings and distances, sprouted from desks and were copied in shops that smelled of ink and hide glue. Navigation manuals noted wind patterns and currents with the piety of men who knew they owed their lives to habits written down. Venetian glass blessed science again in the form of lenses. Better cristallo allowed finer grinding. Spectacles had already crept into daily life. Later, when a Paduan professor named Galileo began tinkering with spyglasses, he found in Venice both craftsmen to polish the glass and a senate eager to be shown distant ships enlarged on the lagoon's horizon. Art and architecture drank from these same wells of precision and appetite. Painters in Venice became famous for colour, colorito, because the lagoon's light taught them it could carry form on its back. The Bellini family, then Giorgione and Titian, and later Tintoretto and Veronese, made canvases that seemed wet with reflection. Patrons did not confine genius to palaces. The school, lay confraternities with deep pockets and charitable missions, commissioned cycles that ordinary people could see. Walk into the Scuola Grande di San Rocco and you step under Tintoretto's rolling drama, a sustained performance painted for a brotherhood that fed the poor. Mosaics in San Marco whispered Byzantium, canvases shouted Venice. Outside, facades carried a grammar of blended bloodlines, Byzantine domes, pointed Gothic windows with stone lace, Renaissance calm, and the later clarity of Palladio. His churches, San Giorgio Maggiore across the water from the Doge's palace, and Il Redentore on the Giudecca, used proportion as a kind of music. The Redentore, vowed in thanks for the end of a plague in 1576, shows what the city expected from ideas, beauty with a job to do. Every summer a bridge of boats was laid to it for a night of Thanksgiving. Fireworks echoed, families ate on terraces, and architecture proved that it could heal to ritual without losing its dignity. Nearby, the Biblioteca Marciana, built to house knowledge across from the Doge's palace like a deliberate counterweight, told visitors that government here met learning on equal terms, at least in stone. Music flowed through all of it. In the galleries of San Marco, choirs were split into groups that answered each other across space. The Gabrielli family wrote for those vaults with trumpets and cornets filling the air like poured gold. In an orphanage run as a music school, the Pietà, young women learned to play and sing behind lattice screens. Composers wrote for them. Visitors sat with heads tilted back, baffled that excellence could blossom in a room funded by charity. Ideas in Venice often presented themselves as pleasures first, light on glass, a book that fit in a pocket, a facade that looked inevitable, a chord progression that felt like a bridge over water, and only later did you realize how carefully the pleasure had been engineered. Behind the scenes, a web of small innovations held the grand ones upright. Paper mills on the mainland fed printers with reliable stock. Ink recipes were guarded nearly as tightly as glass formulas. Measuring rods for builders lived in magistrates' offices. The Senate's privileges to inventors made a dockyard mechanic as welcome as a humanist with a new index. The city did not worship novelty. It hired it, tested it, and if it worked, wrote it into the schedule. If a thing endowed clarity, of sight, of text, of space, of sound, it belonged. The lagoon taught that lesson daily. You do not make the water obey. You learn to see it better, name it better, and slide along it more surely. Morning in Venice began with bells and feet on stone. The lagoon lifted its shoulder against the quays, and the city's errands took their places. At the Skerry, the small boatyards tucked into quiet canals, carpenters shaped ribs and planks for gondolas, sanded hulls propped at elegant angles, and boiled pitch that sent a sweet, resinous scent under low bridges. The Skerro at San Travaso is a memory of that rhythm, a sloped yard, a wooden shed, a narrow landing where a new boat can taste water for the first time. Tools hung where hands expected them, adzes, planes, calipers that read curves instead of numbers. A good hull is a conversation between wood and wake, and Squero masters had learned the local dialect. The city moved by water even when it only wished to cross it. For centuries there was a single bridge over the Grand Canal at Rialto, and later a second and a third, but not nearly enough for a people with appointments, so ferries, the traghetti, rode a short diagonal from one bank to the other. You stood, braced in a low boat, the oarsman planted his blade into the green, 2 strokes, and you were in another neighbourhood. Everyone rowed, sailors late for a bell, noblemen with the habit of sitting like statues, women carrying baskets, children with breadcrumbs still on their chins. Fares were small, rituals precise, tempers stored for real emergencies. The gondola became the city's private carriage, but its famous silhouette is a palimpsest of utility. Over centuries it lengthened and flattened to slide through shoals. Its bottom stayed nearly level to rest gently on shallow water. Its prow grew that iron comb, the ferro, whose S-curve suggests the Grand Canal, and whose teeth are sometimes said to count the sestieri, the 6 districts of the city. Rowers stood to one side, and hulls were built asymmetrical to track straight under a single oar. Laws, with their usual Venetian blend of sense and symbolism, made gondolas wear black, to curb the arms race of decoration, to keep the city's look calm, to make the bright interior fabrics and lanterns feel like a secret. In a place where everyone eventually knows where you live, the gondola offered the gift of a moving room. At Rialto, daily bread was a supervised miracle. Grain buyers bargained north and south to keep flour coming, magistrates checked loaves by weight, bakers learned that a fine is heavier than water. The Erbaia, the produce market by the canal, stacked seasons in colour. Artichokes from Sant'Erasmo, heaps of chicory, tomatoes much later on. The pesceria clattered with knives and laughter. Fish lay in tidy cold rows, sardines, mackerel, eels coiled like punctuation, sprinkled with crushed ice, a modern trick added to old habits. Kitchen smells drifted out of courtyards, onions softening in oil, bay leaf popping against the pan, fish marinating with vinegar and raisins for sardi and sao, polenta cooling in a slab to be sliced later, salt cod, bacala, soaked and whipped with garlic into a cloud. Wine arrived from the mainland. Tiny bars, Baccari, poured a glass and set down a plate of sicchetti, small snacks that turn a 5-minute errand into a half-hour conversation. Work filled the day, but it did not cut it into lonely pieces. Confraternities, the school, braided neighbourhoods into communities. Each had a devotion, a charter, a treasury, and a sense of purpose. They paid dowries for poor girls, organised funerals, visited the sick, and hired musicians for feasts. Their buildings were civic pride made tangible. Polished floors, carved staircases, canvases on walls that made even a porter stand a bit straighter inside them. Membership required dues and manners. The reward was belonging in a city where the sea could make a man feel small. On major feast days, processions slid through the Calli and Campi, candles in hands, banners tossing slightly in the breeze, brass bands catching and losing rhythms as the sound bounced off brick and stone. Rules about clothing and conduct operated like channel markers. Sumptuary laws tried to keep velvet and jewels from inflaming envy. Courtesans, the famous cortigiane oneste, were allowed to dress richly, but were expected to live by published codes that, in practice, made them arbiters of fashion and conversation. They read, hosted, argued, and blurred the line between vice and salon in a way only Venice would tolerate. Masks appeared for carnival, but also for a time on many other days. The Borta, a white beak-like face with a black cloak and tricorn hat, let men and women move in public with a borrowed anonymity that both amused and worried magistrates. Gambling houses, ridotti, flickered with candles and quiet ruin. The Signori di Notte, the night magistrates, tried to keep order when wine and masks pushed citizens toward foolishness. Evenings tasted different depending on the season. In summer, a little wind wandered in from the lagoon and cooled the stones. Families ate outside. Musicians tested a new tune under a window, the smell of pitch from a scarrow mixed with frying fish. In winter, fog pressed close, muffled feet, and made lantern halos around doorways and boat prows. The city had few streetlights until late. People walked with care, counting bridges by memory, whistling softly so friends could recognize them approaching out of the grey. Night noises were small. A door bar sliding into its slot, an oar knocking gently, a dog deciding against a bark, a bell telling the hour not for precision but reassurance. Home was usually a few rooms behind a facade whose age could be guessed by the style of its windows. Families lived up rather than out. The ground floor might be a magasin, a storage room for boats and tools that accepted occasional flooding as the price of convenience. Water came from rain caught and filtered in the wellheads that punctuated campi and campielli. Every home valued a clean roof as much as a clean floor because roofs were part of the drinking system. Women's work crossed thresholds, lace made on Burano, linen mended, children taught to read psalms and reckon prices, errands run that stitched small economies together. Men drifted between callings, porter, sailor, clerk, depending on season and fortune. Slower afternoons saw chess under arcades, a dice game, a debate no one intended to win. Public health was a craft learned the hard way. When a ship raised a flag at the lagoon's edge asking entry, officials rowed out to ask questions. Where from? How long? Any illness aboard? Suspicion sent a vessel to a lazaretto, an island quarantine where cargo was aired on racks, and people waited out the disease's likely window behind walls. Inside the city, plague seasons brought white crosses painted on doors, black clothes, vows kept or broken. Recovery brought feasts, Festa del Redentore in July with its temporary bridge and fireworks, Festa della Salute in November, another votive bridge over cold water and candles dripping wax on church steps. Venice remembered its sorrows with architecture and annual walks, turning grief into a schedule the same way it turned tides into timetables. Entertainment was both organised and invented daily. Regattas sent boats sprinting down straight stretches of canal to cheers from balconies. The Ponte dei Pugni, the Bridge of Fists, saw rival neighbourhood teams, Castellani and Nicolotti, grapple and splash in traditional brawls that were finally outlawed when bones and pride broke too often. Theatre arrived in wooden playhouses that bloomed and burned. Opera took root with all the glamour a masked city could give it. Coffee houses later gathered news and nonsense under painted ceilings. Yet much of life's sweetness belonged to the unplanned. A scrap of song from a passing boat, a flock of birds pivoting at once above a square, a friend catching your sleeve to show you a new book with a typeface so fine it made you squint. Strangers came, of course, traders, pilgrims, scholars, but not yet in the tidal crowds that would later turn alleys into queues. A foreigner was noticed and folded politely into the city's rhythm, or steered toward the fondaco if business was their language. The city's people were busy with each other, negotiating marriages and dowries at the Monte del Dotti, the public dowry fund, calculating the value of a partnership in a colleganza, deciding which saints date a favour with a little extra music. Nobles invested quietly in ventures while insisting they did not sully their hands with trade. Citizens without noble titles built careers as notaries, pilots, and clerks. Labourers found dignity in steady work and a well-kept door. What held all these disparate scenes together was an ethic as practical as a coiled rope. Maintain what you have, make beauty work for its keep, distrust extremes, and let the city's shared schedules, bells, markets, ferries, feasts, carry private lives along. Before visitors came to collect the place in pictures, Venetians inhabited it as a series of useful miracles: a glass that did not cloud, a book that flattened distances, a boat that obeyed a single oar, a well that sweetened rain, a festival that made thankfulness walkable. The rest was repetition, and repetition here was how people turned a floating city into home. Beneath the domes and campanili, care took the shape of buildings that sang. Walk along the Riva on a bright morning, and you would hear music spilling from behind latticed windows, violins testing a scale, voices warming into harmony. Then turn a corner and see a line of widows at a doorway where a brotherhood dispensed bread and small coins. Venice practiced charity the way it practiced seamanship, with rules, schedules, and a flair for turning necessity into art. The great lay confraternities, the Scuole Grandi, kept treasuries and statutes as meticulous as any counting house. They bought grain in lean years, endowed dowries for girls whose families could not raise them, paid for funerals when death arrived with no purse at hand, and commissioned paintings that made their halls into slow, civic sermons. In the Scuola Dalmata of the Schiavoni, sailors from the eastern Adriatic stood under Carpaccio's brisk saints, and saw themselves honoured in colour. In the Scuola di San Rocco, Tintoretto laid storms and miracles across ceilings, so that even a porter with sore shoulders could look up and feel the city's care enlarging him. Hospitals were not merely places to die, they were schools, conservatories and workshops of mercy. The four great ospedali, the Pietà, the Mendicanti, the Incurabili and the Ospedaletto, took in abandoned infants, trained children, tended the sick, and taught music with a seriousness that made visitors sit open-mouthed in pews, while choirs of girls, the figli di coro, filled the air. Behind screens their sound grew strangely vast, as if the city's own breath had learned counterpoint. Composers wrote specifically for their voices and the room's acoustics. Masters drilled them with the same regularity the arsenal demanded of caulkers, and on feast days, gondolas pressed close to their churches to hear the latest motet lifted over the glitter of water. These hospitals kept ledgers too, donations, instruments, the price of strings and reeds, the wages of a maestro, and the arithmetic of kindness made the music possible. Faith moved in many languages and still found ways to share the same stones. Greek traders and sailors worshipped beneath the rounded dome of San Giorgio dei Greci, its iconostasis gleaming like sunrise behind a screen of saints. The bell tower leans a little, as if listening to the hum of the nearby Riva degli Schiavoni, where Dalmatians unloaded cargo. Their own confraternity kept its devotions in a chapel thick with carved wood and painted panels. Armenians maintained a church in town and later a whole island, San Lazzaro, where learned monks kept scripts alive and bound books with a quiet competence that matched the city's. In the Fondaco dei Turci, merchants from the Ottoman world prayed in makeshift spaces, ate familiar food, and counted their accounts with Venetian brokers who spoke a handful of Turkish phrases and many more of arithmetic. Each community kept its rites and rhythms, and the Republic, fussy about order but jealous of profit, made room for all of them so long as contracts were kept and knives stayed sheathed. One neighbourhood, ringed by canals and patrolled by time as much as by guards, tells the story of inclusion circled by caution. In the parish of Cannaregio, a foundry site lent its name to a new arrangement, the ghetto. There, beginning in the early 16th century, Jewish families were required to live, the gates locked at night and opened at dawn. Watchmen paid as much to prevent violence against residents as to keep residents from slipping away at forbidden hours. Within those narrow limits, a dense vertical city rose, houses stacked higher for lack of width, synagogues tucked into upper floors, courtyards that carried languages like stairwells carry familiar smells, Professions were restricted in law and widened in practice. Lenders made small loans that kept stalls open, and households afloat between tides of fortune. Doctors treated Venice's sick and were summoned, hat in hand, into noble homes when illness ignored prejudice. Dealers in old clothes bought and sold fabric in a city that loved finery too much to waste it. Printers set Hebrew type that travelled far beyond the lagoon. Scholars argued legal phrases and mystic breath with an intensity that made the long nights shorter. It would be wrong to paint this as gentleness. The gates were real. The marks of difference in dress and curfew chafed. Rumours sometimes flared. But the daily majority of days saw a compromise. A guarded neighbourhood that still pulsed with commerce, learning, and the ordinary kindnesses of neighbours who borrow salt and share news. Care in Venice often arrived by boat. When fever appeared on a ship at the lagoon's edge, or a sailor died with telltale buboes in his armpit, the officers of health rowed out in a fast craft. Questions were asked, lists taken, faces studied with a caution born from too many funerals. The vessel was sent not to the city but to quarantine, to the lazaretti on the outer islands, where goods were unpacked and aired on racks, letters pierced to admit smoke, bales sprinkled with vinegar, and people waited, counting the days like beads. Guards walked the walls. A priest said mass through a window. Doctors kept their distance and their notes. If, after the count of days, the plague failed to bloom, a clean bill of health was written, sealed, and read at the gate so the city could welcome the ship without fear. In Venice, even safety had paperwork. Houses within the walls smelled of rosemary and juniper when illness crept closer. Doors bore chalk marks. Processions wound toward churches with vows on their lips. When the danger eased, the city kept its promises with stone, a sanctuary raised, a feast day fixed, a bridge of boats laid each year so gratitude could march across water. The Republic's habit of care extended into the smallest devices. A poor widow's name written into a confraternity's register meant a loaf at week's end. A boy's apprenticeship to a scrivener meant a life with ink rather than ore blisters. A noble's bequest, if properly worded, might feed a choir or keep a hospital stocked with linens for decades. Dowry funds, the Monte del Dotti, allowed families to save in the city's bonds toward a daughter's future, turning a private hope into a public instrument that bound households to the state. 1,000 such instruments steadied a society made fragile by water and trade. When strangers arrived, they found a city of rituals that invited them to behave. Wash your hands in our ways, weigh your goods on our scales, keep our hours, respect our modesty and our masks, and you will find your life here similar from tide to tide. On the map, the lagoon looks placid, a puddle pressed between barrier islands and the mainland. In truth, it is a living machine, and Venice spent centuries learning which levers to leave alone and which to pull. Stand at low tide on a winter day and you will see the bones of that machine. Barren, the salt marsh platforms that surface like greenbacks. Velm, the pale shoals that glisten like skin. Gibi, the capillary channels that thread between. Twice a day, the sea pours through the 3 inlets, Lido, Malamocco, Chioggia, rushing in and out like a giant's breath. If you let the rivers dump too much silt into this system, the marsh rises and strangles the channels. The tide grows shallow and weak, and the lagoon dries into malarial mud. If you barricade the sea too hard, the marsh drowns, and the lagoon becomes an arm of the Adriatic, with waves large enough to gnaw palaces to chalk. Between these mistakes lies a narrow path, and Venice made a profession of walking it. Start with the ground under your feet. The city stands on forests you cannot see. Millions of timber piles, oak, elm, larch, driven into mud until oxygen could not reach them. On this vertical lattice, masons laid stone plates of hard Istrian limestone, and then brick walls, light and rhythmic, that could ride the smallest settling without cracking their pride. Builders learned to spare weight where possible, to trust arches and vaults, and a grammar of repetition that kept stresses regular. A palace facade that looks like lace is also a strategy. Emptiness weighs less than stone. Steps and thresholds rose when the water proved too familiar. Ground floors became magazzini, useful rooms that could tolerate a Brenny visit. Living quarters climbed a story, then another, until attics held trunks and half-forgotten chairs. Fresh water, the first daily miracle, came from the sky and the patience of sand. The wells in Venice are not holes but filters, broad, stone-lined cisterns beneath the squares, filled with carefully layered sand that received rain from sloped pavements and rooftops. The water settled, cleaned itself by wandering through grains, and collected in cool darkness until someone lowered a bucket and paid the small price for a taste that did not sting. Magistrates inspected these basins, fined those who fouled them, and published rules about sweeping roofs and keeping gutters clear, because in a floating city the first rule is that nothing useful should be left to chance. Navigation required its own furniture. Out in the channels, tripods of timber, the bricole, rose in ragged lines, marking the safe water as surely as any lighthouse. They looked rough and temporary, bound with rope and crowned with tar, but they carried years of careful measurement in their placement. Boatmen read them at speed. Children learned them the way mainland children memorize hedgerows. Magistrates in small boats checked them after storms and ordered replacements when rot set in. Closer to the city, embankments, fondament, or Istrian stone like armour at the waterline, while beneath the surface divers and dredgers coaxed mud out of the channels and into places where it could settle without closing a vein. The work never stopped, and it did not brag. A good day's dredging ends invisibly, the canal looking as it did in the morning, only safer. The sea-zone wall lay on the long low islands that keep waves from crossing the lagoon with a straight run. Along the ocean side of the Lido and Pellestrina, engineers in the 18th century set the Murazzi, miles of stone embankment packed and faced to shrug off winter storms. They are not pretty in the manner of marble churches. They are beautiful the way a well-tied knot is beautiful, because it does the job and will do it again tomorrow. When wind and tide conspire, green water still leaps their edge. Afterward, crews walk the length, tapping, listening, noting seams that need fresh mortar, writing small instructions that add up to endurance. Further inland, the city tinkered with rivers. For centuries the Brenta, the Piave and the Sile wandered toward the lagoon, carrying silt that threatened to smother its shallow lungs. Venice argued with them by degrees, cutting new channels to send their mud farther south along the coast, reshaping bends, building banks, dredging mouths, and accepting that such surgery must be mild, corrective, and repeated. Too sudden a cut could flood towns and fields. Too timid a gesture would be swallowed by spring melt and autumn flood. Boards of water magistrates, savvy and provveditory, kept maps that were also scorecards. Here a channel deepened by a braccia, there a marsh growing where it should not. In this season a cut, in that a pause. Politics followed water. Landlocked cities wanted different things than a floating one, and Venice's persistence won more often than it lost. Tide itself was measured and made familiar. Pilings on quays bore discreet notches showing the memory of past highs. A sailor could lay a hand against a mark and know whether today's water was in a generous mood. Boatmen who ferried people across the Grand Canal shifted their landing steps as levels changed, an unspoken choreography that kept feet dry most of the time. When the moon and wind brought a higher than usual inundation, the city did not panic so much as hop. People laced on high wooden clogs, zoccoli, or found dry alleys they had learned in childhood. Shopkeepers lifted goods from the floor, voices grew drier, jokes sharper, and by afternoon the water often fell away as if nothing had happened, leaving a scent of salt and a reminder chalked on the wall by memory alone. Everything that touched water carried a maintenance plan. Bridges were checked for sag in their stone ribs. Gates at the ends of narrow canals were cleaned of the weed that slowed the flow. Boatyards inspected slipways for the small rot that, left alone, becomes catastrophe. The great open fronts of palaces, the Porta d'Acqua where barges slid in beneath painted ceilings, were more than display. They were functional mouths through which goods, chairs, guests, dowries and coffins passed. Their thresholds were rebuilt in harder stone when they wore thin. Their steps grew an extra riser as habits of water shifted over a century. Venice preferred to fix a thing a little too soon rather than a little too late. The city understood that water never sleeps, and complacency is a soft wood. Language itself reveals the pact with the sea. Streets are calli, narrow as the space between boats at a busy quay. Salisade are the rare paved arteries lifted slightly higher to keep feet dry. Campi are squares named like fields because they once were, and because the city insists on thinking of itself as a place with sky and open space, even when none is left at ground level. The Fondamenta Nuove faces the outer lagoon like a deliberate eyelid. The Zattere and Dorsoduro remembers rafts of timber tied along its length to season before the arsenal ate them plank by plank. Names are wayfinding for memory, and in a city where landmarks can mirror themselves on water and fog can make a familiar bridge strange, memory is a compass, even morality learned from tide. The Magistrato alle Acque did not simply file maps, it policed greed. A man who extended his garden a few steps into a canal stole depth from boats. A merchant who dumped waste where the current ran slow built a private convenience and a public hazard. Fines were levied, stubborn offenders met harsher consequence, and the city wrote into law what sailors know in their bones, that the commons, water, wind, channel, is a shared hull, and a hole anywhere is everyone's problem. In return, the city gave something back: steady dredging, clean wellheads, maintained embankments, and the quiet security of a horizon held in place by stones you would never think to praise until the day a storm tests them. At dusk, when the tide turns and the green in the canals deepens, you can hear the small voices of this maintenance if you listen. A mallet taps oakum into a seam. A rope creaks as someone tightens a line against a new level. A broom sweeps a square, so tonight's rain will enter the cistern clean. Oarlocks cluck as a ferry adjusts to a temporary landing. A mason folds his tools. Knowing the patch he laid today will be invisible tomorrow and vital a year hence. Holding back the sea here meant not defiance but conversation. Constant, reasonable, and a little stubborn. The water answered twice a day. The city answered every hour. The balance began to tilt quietly, like a gondola shifting as passengers changed seats. A city that once brokered everything between east and west felt new routes forming beyond its reach. When Portuguese caravels rounded Africa and touched India directly at the end of the 15th century, spices began to smell of the Atlantic as much as the Levant. Venice did not collapse. It adjusted. It bought more grain from the Po Valley and Apulia, took firmer hold of mainland towns, Padua, Verona, Vicenza, Brescia, to secure food, timber and roads, and doubled down on what it knew: measured law, careful finance, steady convoys. But the centre of the map had moved a little, and the city felt it like a coolness under the door. War taught the same lesson in another language. The empire across the water grew into the Ottomans and pressed hard on Venice's island chain. Cyprus was lost after ferocious sieges in 1570 to 1571. The Great Battle of Lepanto in 1571 brought a thunderclap of victory at sea, and then a quick realization that the world does not pause long for triumphs. The enemy rebuilt, treaties were signed, trade resumed on new terms. Later, the long agony of the Cretan War ended in 1669 with the fall of Candia after a siege that spanned a generation. In each case, the Republic paid with fortresses and regained in parchment the right to keep buying and selling. It was a hard arithmetic that favoured endurance over glory. Plague visited, adding its own discounts to the ledger of ambition. The waves of 1575 to 1577 and 1630 cut deep into the city's numbers. Venice answered with vows and stone. the Redentor rising on the Giudecca after the first epidemic, Il Salute at the mouth of the Grand Canal after the second. The health office tightened its procedures. The Lazaretti Islands refined quarantine into a schedule with charts and rules. Life resumed, because it had to. Music returned to the Ospedali. The Arsenal's hammers found their tempo again. Markets filled at Rialto. But the idea that prosperity could be permanent had grown thinner. If power ebbed, splendour did not. The 18th century in Venice felt like a candle that refuses to gutter. Quick, bright, social, and a little reckless. The city turned inward with style. Playwrights sharpened comedies. Goldoni trimmed masks from theatre and gave characters the habits of real neighbours. Gozzi stitched fables back on like sequins. Painters studied their own city as if it were a subject from myth. Canaletto made the light logical, a geometry of water and stone that travellers could frame and carry home. Guardi smudged it into memory, the air vibrating with shimmer. Tiepolo climbed ladders and poured clouds onto ceilings in palaces and chapels so that the eye learned to tilt upward for pleasure. The ridotti, the private gaming houses, glowed with candles and risk. Masks multiplied. Gossip worked as fast as money. And cafes along Piazza San Marco, Florian since 1720, Quadri a little later poured chocolate and conversation that lingered until the bell said it was already tomorrow. Beneath the brightness, the machine of state kept the same careful habits. Councils met, votes clicked in urns, privileges were granted for printing and inventions. The Arsenal still launched hulls, though more slowly, and the Stato da Mar, those outposts strung along the Adriatic and Aegean, looked more like pearls kept for their beauty than for their strategic bite. The mainland possessions mattered more, rivers managed, roads kept safe, wheat measured by men who knew that hunger makes politics impatient. Venice had become, in part, a land power, and that truth sat oddly in a city that measured itself by tides. The end, when it came, used modern words. Revolution reached the Adriatic in a French accent. In the spring of 1797, under the pressure of Napoleon's armies and their rearrangement of Italy, the Great Council gathered for the last time. The Doge, Ludovico Manian, set aside the Corno Ducal, the old Promission, those clauses that had thickened for centuries, no longer bound anyone. The Republic, after more than 1,000 years, dissolved itself rather than be cracked by force. French commissioners arrived with youthful certainty. Democratic committees formed. The Arsenal's keys turned in new hands. Art and archives were inventoried. Some treasures travelled west as war indemnities. Others stayed and gathered dust under different seals. By autumn, Venice had been bartered without being asked. The Treaty of Campo Formio handed the city to the Habsburgs in exchange for other territories. A few years later, Napoleon returned and folded Venice into his Kingdom of Italy. Then, after his fall, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 restored Austrian rule over Lombardy, Venetia. Flags changed more than streets did. The Doge's palace hosted bureaucrats instead of elections. The Arsenal lost its preeminence to modern dockyards elsewhere. The lagoon's channel still needed dredging, and the city, even now, knew how to do that. Infrastructure, more quietly than armies, redrew life. In 1846, a railway causeway reached Venice from the mainland, a long low line of stone and iron that taught travellers to think of the lagoon not as a moat but as a commute. Steamers puffed where galleys once flexed. A station rose near the garden of Santa Lucia, and the names of far places fit onto a timetable. The novelty cut two ways. It brought grain and visitors more reliably. It also brought the feeling that time could now be saved or wasted in a place that had measured hours by bells and tides. The city learned the sound of whistles. The spring of 1848 gave back something old. Revolutions moved across Europe, and Venice, under Daniele Mania and Niccolò Tomaseo, declared a revived Republic of San Marco. The flag with the lion flew again on the masts. committees met under portraits of men who had not expected to be needed once more. For more than a year, the city held out, repairing fortifications, organising supplies, suffering bombardment from Austrian guns on the Lido and mainland forts. Cholera joined the besiegers. In August 1849, exhausted and starved of powder as much as of food, the city capitulated. The lion came down. Austrian regularity returned. The episode seasoned memory with pride and sorrow both. When Venice joined the Kingdom of Italy in 1866 after another war and another plebiscite, the city's political story finally aligned with the peninsula's. The habit of governance, registries, auditors, water boards, continued under new ministries. Restoration became a civic preoccupation. The basilica's mosaics were cleaned and repaired according to the taste of the day. The ducal palace's stones were surveyed and mended, bridges were strengthened and refaced, embankments extended. Outsiders began to argue with locals about what authentic meant. John Ruskin wrote pages of love and reproach in the middle of the 19th century, denouncing clumsy restorations and praising Gothic grace. His words made travellers see tracery and capitals as moral lessons rather than mere decoration. The city discovered that it had acquired critics as intense as any rival fleet. The Grand Tour, once an aristocrat's classroom, swelled into something busier. Steam made itineraries easier. Guidebooks told visitors where to stand to get the right view. Artists set up easels in predictable corners. Hotels grew from palaces with new front desks. The old Dandolo Palace on the Riva became the Danieli, and learned to receive newcomers with polished staircases and practiced courtesy. The Lido, a sandbar that had long been simply the city's first shield against the Adriatic, put on a new costume in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bathing establishments, summer pavilions, later grand hotels with verandas facing the sea. Venice had been a working port, a cautious superpower, a careful commonwealth. Now it was also becoming a place to be seen, a stage set that had outlived its playwrights. Art adjusted to the new audience without losing its nerve. In 1895, the city founded an international exhibition in the gardens east of San Marco, a biennale that invited nations to build pavilions and hang their newest ambitions on the walls. The lagoon's light, which had schooled Titian and Tintoretto, now tutored modernists. The walkways filled with painters and critics. The cafes with arguments that rarely disturbed the bricole in the channels or the dredgers' schedules. Music never stopped. Opera houses burned and were rebuilt. Church choirs kept their modest miracles. Even as industries moved to Marghera and Mestre on the mainland, even as the arsenal's hum faded into heritage, the city's habit of turning craft into ceremony persisted. Memory here learned the craft of survival. The great campanile of San Marco fell without warning in 1902, a slow, straight collapse that crushed the old Loggia and left a pale cloud in the square. The city decided at once to rebuild as it was, where it was. Stones were numbered, foundations improved. A decade later, the bell tower stood again, a new copy with an old soul, so that the skyline's grammar was intact. That phrase, as it was where it was, became not just a plan for a tower, but a method for a civilization. Preserve the outline, improve the underneath, pretend less than you repair, and let the eye be comforted even if the engineer knows what has changed. Water remained the most faithful adversary. High tides made their old seasonal visits. Some were impertinent. The city responded with platforms in winter, portable walkways raised on trestles in Piazza San Marco, and routines that felt as ancient as they were improvisational. The Marazzi on the Barrier Islands, those 18th century walls against the Adriatic, were patched and repointed. Rivers on the mainland still needed shepherding. Locks and dredging still translated policy into depth under keels. Conservationists learned the chemistry of salt and stone. Families learned to keep valuables a shelf higher. Glassmakers on Murano adjusted recipes to modern fuel while keeping the old gestures alive. By now the city had grown used to being looked at. Writers came and saw themselves in reflective water. Some loved the languor, some distrusted it. Painters painted gondolas that carried more mood than passengers. Photographs froze the same views every decade and still could not empty them of surprise on a foggy morning. Meanwhile, fish still arrived at the Pesceria before sunrise, artichokes still came from Sant'Erasmo in spring, and an oar still clicked in its forecollar as a boy learned to keep a straight line in a frisky crosswind. Venice's public face, masks, music, pageants, facades, grew more famous than its private industry, but the private industry did not vanish. It moved behind doors, into workshops, and across causeways to roomier plots on the mainland. What had been power, the ability to compel, slid into authority of a calmer kind, the ability to teach by example. A basilica that blends Byzantine and Gothic and Renaissance in the same embrace tells a traveller that civilizations can stack without crushing each other. A republic that wrote limits onto its own head of state leaves behind a palace whose rooms are long with light and law. A city that married the sea with a ring for centuries teaches that rituals matter most when they carry humility inside their gold. The place remembers, and it offers that memory to anyone who will slow down long enough to feel the timing of tides under their feet. At the end of a long day, the marble still keeps a little warmth, and the stones along the Zatter smell faintly of salt. A bell rolls over the roofs and into the dark like a coin along a table. Somewhere a craftsman extinguishes a furnace and checks the annealing kiln one last time. Somewhere a conservator closes a notebook and pats the page to be sure the ink is dry. A porter ties a boat with a knot his grandfather taught him. A clerk locks a door in an office that was once a counting house, and before that perhaps a storeroom for silk. The city is quieter than it was when galleys shoved off for Cyprus, louder than it was when fishermen hid among the reeds, and truer to itself than either image alone. What remains is a habit of attention, to waterlines, to measures, to promises, and a talent for making yesterday visible, without turning today into a museum. In that attention lies the last strength of a place that once commanded seas and now holds something gentler but just as rare. A memory so well kept it can still be lived in.